there is something you are still carrying. You know what it is? You don't need it described in detail. It's the thing that comes back when you least expect it in a quiet moment, or when a specific song plays, or when someone says something that sounds just enough like what they said. The memory returns, and with it, the full weight of what was done. The anger, or the grief, or the thing that is neither and both. Whatever it is, it arrived in your life uninvited. Someone made a choice or choices that cost you something real. Maybe it cost you years. Maybe it cost you trust in people you should have been able to trust. Maybe it cost you a version of yourself that you never quite recovered. The specifics belong to you, but the weight, the weight is something I can describe because it has a texture that is almost universal. It arrives with you in the morning. It waits for you in quiet moments. It distorts the future by keeping you anchored in the past. You've thought about forgiveness. Maybe you've been told you should. Maybe someone well meaning said it in a way that made it worse, as if you simply hadn't tried hard enough, or wanted to hold on, or were choosing to stay wounded. Maybe you've tried and found the forgiveness didn't stay. A week later, the anger came back full force, and you felt like you'd failed at something you were already struggling with. Maybe the very word feels like an insult, as if forgiving would mean admitting it wasn't that serious, or releasing someone from a debt they genuinely owe you, as if the act of letting go would erase the testimony that something real happened. I want to suggest that forgiveness is not what you think it is. Not because what was done to you wasn't serious, not because you are wrong to still feel it, but because the version of forgiveness most of us carry, the one that feels impossible, is built on a misunderstanding of what forgiveness actually does. Three people, three different wounds. And in each story, something that rewrites what the word means. Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers sold him, not abandoned, not left behind, sold to a caravan of traders heading to Egypt for 20 pieces of silver. They took his coat, the one that marked him as the favored son, made it look like he'd been killed by an animal, and brought it back to their father. Jacob grieved for years. He refused to be comforted. The text says he said, I will go down to the grave mourning my son. Joseph was not dead. He was alive in Egypt, a foreign country, a foreign language, a foreign world, working as a slave in the house of a man named Potiphar. And here is the detail the story pauses on. The Lord was with Joseph. Joseph prospered. He did everything right. He earned trust. He rose to authority in the household. He became the man Potiphar relied on for everything. And then Potiphar's wife accused him of something he had not done. She accused him because he refused her, because he said, I will not do this great wickedness and sin against God. And she turned his refusal into a crime. He went to prison. Stop there for a moment, because this is the structure of what Joseph was carrying when his story eventually resolves. It wasn't just the pit, it wasn't just the sale, it was the betrayal at 17, slavery, faithfulness that led nowhere, a false accusation from someone he had chosen to protect, prison. He did everything right, and it kept getting worse. In prison, he interpreted dreams for two men, the cupbearer and the baker. He asked the cupbearer, the one whose dream was good, to remember him when he got out. The cupbearer forgot him for 2 full years. 2 years. He was eventually released, not because justice finally arrived, not because someone recognized what had been done to him, but because Pharaoh had a dream no one else could interpret. Joseph was brought from the prison, interpreted the dream, and was made second in command of all of Egypt. At 30 years old, 13 years after his brothers sold him, he stood at the height of a civilization. And then the famine came, and his brothers came to Egypt. They stood in front of him, the brother they had sold, not knowing who he was. They bowed down, just as his dream at 17 had said they would. Joseph recognized them immediately. He could have destroyed them. He had the power, he had the position. He had access to everything that the most powerful nation in the known world could offer. And he had the justification, not the petty justification of a grudge, but the documented, legitimate, earned justification of a man who had lost 13 years of his life because of what they did. Instead, he turned away from them and wept. He went into another room and wept. And then he came back. He had been testing them, watching whether his brother Benjamin was safe with them, watching whether they had changed, whether the cruelty they'd shown him had been extended to the youngest. And when he saw the answer, he could not contain himself any longer. He said, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? His brothers could not answer him because they were terrified. He said, Come close to me. And when they came close, he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, because God sent me before you to preserve life. Read that sentence again. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves. Joseph was not minimizing what they had done. Elsewhere in the text, he refers plainly to the fact that they sold him. He does not pretend it didn't happen. But in this moment, The moment of power, the moment when he could have made them pay everything, he released them from the weight of what they had done. Not because they had apologized, not because they had come to him offering restitution. They had come to Egypt during a famine to buy food. They had no idea who he was or what he was about to do. He chose to release the weight before they ever asked him to. And this is the thing the story is asking us to see: that release was not for them, it was for him. Joseph had spent 13 years carrying the story of what they did. He had carried it through the pit and the slave market and Potiphar's house and the prison and the 2 years of being forgotten after doing something for someone who promised to remember. He had carried it all the way to the height of Egypt. The weight does not transfer back to the person who caused it by holding it long enough. It only ever costs the one who holds it. Joseph understood in that room that if he continued to hold what they had done to him, he would be the one still in the pit. They were standing in front of him. He was the one who would go back. Jesus said it from the cross: not before, not after, during, while the harm was still being committed, while the nails were being driven, while the crowd stood below watching, while the people responsible were close enough to hear him. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." There is an entire world of meaning in the word not, for they know not what they do. This is not a moral exemption. The people crucifying him did know what crucifixion was. They had done it before. What they did not know, what they could not comprehend in that moment, was the full weight of what they were committing. They could not see from inside that afternoon what that afternoon would mean. And into that gap, the gap between what they understood and what was actually happening, Jesus released forgiveness. There is no waiting for justice in that sentence. There is no conditional forgive them if they apologize, forgive them after they understand, forgive them when they deserve it, forgive them when they face consequences. There is no contingency. The forgiveness was spoken into the air while the act was still in progress. Think about what this required. This was not the composure of someone who hadn't been hurt. This was a man who, the night before, had sweated blood in a garden asking if there was another way. A man who had been betrayed by someone he had trusted for 3 years. A man who had been illegally tried, beaten, and brought to a hill outside the city to be executed publicly. The pain was real. The injustice was total. And in the middle of all of it, he chose what he would hold. This is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is not the spiritual performance of someone who didn't feel the weight. It is a refusal, a deliberate, costly, willed refusal to let what was being done to him define what he would carry out of it. The cross would not become the bitterness that shaped everything after. He chose in that moment what the next thing would be. And the next thing was not the accumulation of what they had done, it was release. The ones being forgiven may not have heard him. The crowd was loud. Some of them were mocking. The soldiers were working. No one changed their behavior because of what he said. The forgiveness had no visible effect on the people it was directed toward. And that is the point. The forgiveness was not for them. It was for him. It was the act of a man who refused to let the worst thing ever done to him become the thing that defined him forever. Stephen was being stoned. He was the first person put to death for his faith in the weeks after the resurrection. A man who had been chosen to do ordinary work, serving tables, making sure the widows in the community were cared for. His job was practical and unglamorous. He served food, he kept records, he made sure no one was overlooked. And then people came who could not answer his arguments. And so they fabricated charges and they stirred up a crowd and they brought him before the council and they found witnesses who would lie. The process was recognizable. It is the process of people who have decided on a verdict and are working backward to justify it. Stephen's response was not to defend himself in the way a lawyer defends a client. He told a story, the long story of Israel from Abraham to Solomon, and then he pointed at what was in front of him and named it plainly. He said, "You are the ones who received the law but did not keep it." The crowd did not receive this well. They dragged him out of the city and threw stones at him. Luke records that the witnesses, the people who had given false testimony against him, laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul so their arms would be free to throw. And while they were throwing the stones, Stephen looked up and said, "I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." He was not performing, he was describing what he saw. They threw harder, they covered their ears and rushed at him. And as they stoned him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then he knelt down, not fell down, knelt down. The posture matters. He knelt and he cried with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And then he died. The prayer was not for him. He was not asking to be spared. He was not negotiating. He made two requests in his last moments, and they are instructive in their order. First, he asked for himself, "Receive my spirit." Then immediately, he asked for the people killing him, "Do not hold this against them." He did not ask, "Make them stop." He did not ask, "Let them see what they are doing." He did not ask, give them what they deserve. He asked that what they were doing not be counted against them. The people throwing the stones gave him nothing. They did not stop. They did not hear him. They did not change. He let go anyway. Stephen understood in those last moments something that is very difficult to understand from inside a wound. He understood that forgiveness is not a transaction. It is not something you extend to someone in exchange for their repentance, or in exchange for their acknowledgement, or in exchange for the world treating them the way they should be treated. It is something you do with your own hands for your own sake, for the sake of what you carry out of the moment and into whatever comes next. The young man named Saul, watching the coats of the witnesses so they could throw more freely, he would eventually encounter the risen Jesus on a road outside Damascus. He would become Paul. He would write more of the New Testament than any other author. He would describe himself as the chief of sinners and would never forget that the first sin in that description was standing at the edge of the crowd while Stephen died. Stephen did not know any of that. He could not have known it. He let go without knowing what the letting go would set in motion. Three people, three completely different wounds, three completely different contexts, one pattern. Joseph forgave brothers who had taken 13 years of his life. He forgave them without their apology. He forgave them before they understood who he was. He forgave them with the full power to have done otherwise. Jesus forgave people who were in the act of crucifying him. He forgave without conditions. He forgave without contingency. He forgave while the harm was still being committed. Stephen forgave people who were killing him. He forgave out loud so they might have heard, knowing they probably wouldn't change. He forgave people who were still throwing stones when the prayer left his lips. None of them waited for justice before releasing the weight. None of them extended forgiveness because the other person had earned it. None of them forgave because the wound wasn't real. They all understood from three entirely different positions across centuries in three entirely different kinds of harm that the holding does not protect you. Every day you carry what was done to you, you are still in the moment when it happened. The person who caused the wound may have moved on. They may be sleeping fine. They may not think about it the way you do, but you are still there in that room at that moment. The wound's still open, the evidence still in your hands. Forgiveness is not a verdict. It does not say the act was acceptable. It does not say the person was right. It does not release them from the consequences that exist in the world, from the natural results of what they did, from what God may require of them. It does not minimize the damage. It does not erase the evidence. What forgiveness says is this: I am no longer willing to let what you did determine what I carry. That is a different thing than what you may have been told. And it is something you can choose before you feel it. Joseph chose it before the emotion had resolved. He wept. He turned away. He composed himself. And then he spoke the release. It was a decision that preceded the feeling of peace, not a feeling that preceded the decision. You don't have to understand the person who hurt you. You don't have to agree with how they see it. You don't have to minimize the cost. You don't have to wait for them to apologize. You don't have to wait for justice to arrive or for the world to correct what was done. You just have to decide whether you are willing to stop letting what they did continue to take from you. The wound was real. The loss was real. The years you carried this, the ways it shaped how you trust, the ways it arrives uninvited in quiet moments, all of it is real. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. Joseph didn't. Jesus didn't. Stephen didn't. But the weight was never going to transfer back to the person who caused it by holding it long enough. It has only ever cost the one who holds it. The one who lets go is the one who gets free. Not free from the memory, not free from the fact of what happened, free from the obligation to keep carrying it, free from the room, free to be somewhere other than the moment when it happened. That is what this is for. That is what Joseph understood, weeping in an Egyptian room, when he looked at the men who had sold him and chose to give them something they had not asked for and did not deserve. That is what the cross means in the middle of the cruelty before the morning of the third day. That is what Stephen understood, kneeling in the stones, speaking his last coherent sentence as a prayer, not for himself, but for the people ending his life. The one who lets go is the one who gets free. And you are the one this is written for.